Hello, my name is Simon Bratt, and I'm going to be presenting the death of Antonin Scalia for my TOK presentation. My real-life situation came about when I heard about the death of Supreme Court Judge Antonin Scalia. This made nearly every headline on February 16, 2016. Not long after, the Republicans in Congress were filling the headlines with a vow to block every nominee President Obama nominates. I was surprised to see how politicized the law has become, especially after hearing Majority Leader Mitch McConnell say it is important for the Senate to give the people a voice in the filling of this vacancy. Obviously, this is an excuse to not vote for one of Obama's nominees. I was led to the question of why Supreme Court nominees are being selected based off their political ideology as opposed to their past decisions based on law. After hearing about the Republicans in Congress and how they are refusing to confirm one of Obama's nominees before one is even chosen, I considered the reasons why they would make this decision. One, they simply do not like President Obama and have a desire to undermine him. Or two, they want to wait until the new president is in and hope for a more conservative president who will push for a more conservative judge and facilitate their interests. Moreover, these considerations led me to question why there is a difference between a conservative or liberal Supreme Court judge. After all, shouldn't they be making their decisions based on the law? This brought about the knowledge question of how language influences ethical standards. Before we answer this question, it's important to define some of the terms used. So, language, as a way of knowing, is associated with communication, both written and spoken, important for the law because most of it's on paper. Language is developed at a very young age and then accordingly shapes the way we think. Ethics is a reference to how one should live their life morally. Different cultures produce different sets of morals, and each person has their own unique interpretation of what is right and wrong in the world. So how does language influence an individual's ethical standards? Well, there's an abundant amount of examples on how language shapes ethics in politics. For one, we can look at how nations are described. In the past, they used to be called third world countries, but now they're called developing nations to elicit their economic development. In the past, a fireman was the name for a firefighter, but gender-neutral language has now created the term firefighter to help progress women and get them into the fire force. The government uses language like enhanced interrogation instead of torture to influence the population and, accordingly, their ethical standards. The same can be said about civilian death and collateral damage. So when we look at the law, there's three branches that statutory interpretation breaks into. Statutory interpretation is a process by which courts interpret and apply legislation. In many cases, the words in a statute are ambiguous, so it is the job of the judge to interpret the law. One, we have the golden rule. It allows a judge to depart from a word's normal meaning in order to avoid an absurd result. This allows one to apply a completely different meaning to a law. For example, if a sign said, "Do not use elevator in case of fire," the literal interpretation would be that one can never use an elevator unless there is currently a fire. But this is absurd, so the correct interpretation would be for one to not use elevator when there is a fire. Some criticisms of this viewpoint is that judges are able to change the meaning of law by changing the meaning of words. Second rule is the mischief rule, which is a narrower application of the golden rule. Essentially, it is used to ask what part of the law did the law not cover. In the Smith v. Hughes case in 1960, there were prostitutes on a balcony loitering and soliciting in the street for prostitution. The law reads, "It is a crime for prostitutes to loiter or solicit in the street for the purposes of prostitution." but they were not on the street, they were on their balconies. And they argued because of this they were not breaking the law. The judge applied the mischief rule and found the women guilty. Criticism of this is it gives too much power to the judiciary and it can make law uncertain. Finally, the literal rule says that statutes should be interpreted word by word, the literal meaning of the law. So in the previous case, the women would be found not guilty because they were not literally on the street, they were on the balcony, and the law does not say anything about being on the balcony. But this also has a fault. Words do not have a fixed meaning, they are ambiguous and imprecise, and they change over time. So, looking at these three rules, it is abundantly clear different viewpoints create different conclusions. Are these rules based on reason or emotion more? Well, that's for the judge to determine, and that's why sometimes they hold too much power. With the example of the women on the balcony, the judge can decide either way whether he wants to make them guilty or not. Say he has a grudge against prostitutes, he can find them guilty. And if he thinks prostitution is okay, he can find them non-guilty. With so many different ways of interpreting the law, it is obvious judges are able to base their decisions off personal beliefs. So why does interpretation of the law differ per person? Well, political leaning creates bias. Personal experiences, say from one's youth or older days, shape one's views. But on the other hand, reason should help eliminate these differences. But to counter that, emotion may be seen as a stronger way of knowing that influences personal values. A recent Supreme Court ruling I found interesting was Obama's plan to combat climate change. The Supreme Court blocked the passing of an effort to combat global warming with regulations on emissions from coal plants. This was a 5-4 ruling with 5 conservatives and 5 liberals. Do you want to guess who voted which way? The 5 conservatives voted all in one way, and the 4 liberals all voted one way. Did they interpret the law based on their personal ideology? Well, it seems as though they did, because they all came to the same conclusion. The decision was not based on the law. This decision demonstrates how politicized the law has actually become. The fact that 4 liberals all voted for their interests and the 5 conservatives voted for their interests proves this point. So should a single way of knowing be used to evaluate the law, or should multiple? One versus multiple ways of knowing. If we look at absolutism, this would indicate one way of knowing. There is one right and wrong answer. It has a strength, its ability to be analyzed in a critical, methodical approach, but its weakness is that it deals with problems in a black and white matter. Relativism, which would imply multiple ways of knowing, argues nothing is simply right or wrong, but there are exceptions. This allows for a more rounded solution, but it has the potential for personal bias and subjectivity to lead to an imprecise answer. If we look at an example of overpopulation, we can use a single way of knowing, reason, and kill off half the population. But that would be absurd. If we use a single way of emotion, we would let everyone live. Balance is clearly an important factor, and we need multiple ways of knowing to come to conclusions. So, do we have judges or politicians in black robes? A politician is a person who aims at advancing through a particular party or organization, whereas a judge makes decisions based on the law. The Supreme Court is extremely powerful. They make decisions on issues that impact the entire world, for example, climate change. The election of these officials should be taken with great care and great caution. Overall, I believe it is important to not select judges based on their political leaning, but instead they should demonstrate a balance between liberal and conservative points of view, ultimately leading to a more rational and balanced decision. Thank you.